no fame. Just a fortune.
Thank you for watching. There is a hunger in America for the truth, and tonight I think we're going to blow your mind. You're going to have to ask yourself a couple of questions by the end of the program. Why would our schools leave all of this history out? I mean, this is some of the greatest American story that you've ever heard. Why would they do that? And it's everywhere. You just don't know where to look. If you take a look at the revolutionary paintings of revolutionary times, here it is. It's the Boston Tea Party. Bunch of white guys, and then these people strangely looking like Indians, and they're not. But that's it. Not a lot of racial diversity. If you watch movies, one great movie. This is John Adams. You watch John Adams, and you don't see a lot of racial diversity. I'm currently watching Johnny Tremaine. This is I love this movie. I remember this growing up. I was watching it with my kids just last night, and I noticed there are a couple of American Indians, but you don't see any African Americans unless they're slaves. They will show people as slaves, but that's it. Now, I want to show you a painting of the Battle of Bunker Hill. Here's the Battle of Bunker Hill. Bunch of white guys, right? Unless you know where to look. Right here. That's Peter Salem. He was actually the hero of the battle. It doesn't look like he's a hero there. He looks like he's cowering behind the white guy with a sword. He was the hero of the battle. And he saved scores of American lives that day. Why don't we know this? Look at the picture of the Battle of Lexington. 150 Americans. There it is. Do you see any faces of color in this painting? They were all members of the Reverend Jonas Clark's church. They went out. They were actually, if I'm not mistaken, David, they were in church at the time, right?
He called them together at church,
okay,
yes.
So we called together at church and then said, let's go. And they went to defend their town. When the shot heard around the world was over that day, there were 18 Americans lying on the ground. What you don't see in this painting are the equal numbers of whites and blacks. They were white and black patriots. It was a mixed church. Did you even know that happened? One of those injured patriots on the ground in this painting was a black man named Prince Estabrook. I bet you never heard of Prince Estabrook before. How about the painting of George Washington crossing the Delaware? Bunch of white guys, right? No. Look here. African American, helping row the boat across. You know what his name was? Prince Whipple. He fought alongside Washington during the Revolution. Take a look at this one. This painting of, this is the Marquis de Lafayette. If you look at this, you just think, oh yeah, and then he made his slave dress up like I don't know what. But that's what you would think, right? This guy is incredibly important. This guy may have won the Revolutionary War. James Armistead was his name. How did he win the Revolutionary War? Double spy. I'm going to let David tell the story here in a minute, but basically the Brits thought that he was spying for them, but he was spying for General Washington. He'd give the Brits bad intel and reveal the good critical information to General Washington. Did you know this story?
They were waiting for us. They knew where we would be.
Are you saying there's a breach?
I'm saying they have spies everywhere. that we need the same.
Turn is a true story about America's first spy ring in the Revolutionary War.
This is our history 250-odd years ago, but it's a spy show.
There's lots of suspense, there's lots of mystery created, and all of this is based on real characters.
It's all about the creation of espionage in America.
Why? I'm so tired of people saying, well, it was just the white people, white people, white people. No. Why are we intentionally leaving others out? There are black founders. Let me ask the audience. How many of you can name one person of these pictures? Only one. How many can name only one? Most people, right? Am I mistaken in saying it's Frederick Douglass? Okay. How many can name two of the people here? We've got 6, 8 people. How many can name 3? 4. How many can name 4? 1. And that's David Barton's wife. David, come on up. This is our good friend David Barton. He is the founder and president of Wall Builders, also author of Setting the Record Straight, American History in Black and White. Come on up and sit here. We also have Lucas Morell. Lucas is a professor at Washington and Lee University in Virginia. Welcome. And he is also the author of Lincoln's Sacred Effort. Okay. David, where do we start? Maybe we should start with
James Armistead.
Yeah, the spy.
It's a great one, because James Armistead, after the Battle of Richmond, he's in Virginia, and a lot of the battles did not happen in Virginia. But after the siege of Richmond, he's there. He sees what the British have done in his home state, and he goes to enlist. He said, "I want to help." And he really, I don't know why, but he liked Lafayette. He went to Lafayette, young French general, 19 years old, said, "I want to fight with you." And so they make this agreement. And what happens is James Armistead goes over to Benedict Arnold's camp. He's a British general then, traitor British general, and he says, "Oh, these mean Americans, they mistreat me. I've escaped as a slave. Please let me stay with you." And Arnold says, "Okay, you can wait on us." And so he is part of Benedict Arnold's staff, waiting on Benedict Arnold. And Arnold's one of the generals, which means he meets with all the other generals. So he's meeting with Cornwallis all the time. And so James Armistead is just serving them and doing all the right stuff and just picking up intelligence like crazy. Every day he gets back with Lafayette, says, "Here's what they're doing. Here's where they're going. Here's what they're going to do next." And he kept feeding the information back. And Cornwallis in this time got really comfortable with James and said, "You know, I don't want to ask you to do something you don't want to do, but would you consider being a spy against your former guys there, the Americans? Would you be a British spy and tell us what they're doing?" He said, "Yeah, I guess if you want me to, I will. You know, if you're going to force me to, I will." So he goes back.
It'd be tough getting across the lines, though, but I'll risk it for you.
I'll try it.
Right.
So he ends up saying, "Yeah, I'll do it." And what happens is when they leave Richmond, they decide that they're going down to Yorktown, and they're going to go down there. So what happens is Armistead's fed all that information to Washington and Lafayette. They're going to Yorktown, and he's let the British know that, oh, there's no Americans around down there. It's a real safe place to go. The Americans are elsewhere. So the British the British fleet drops the soldiers off in Yorktown, and the fleet takes off because there's no Americans around. Right then, the French fleet came in and blockaded the port, so the British couldn't get their ships back. And now we've got all the American troops waiting for them when they got up. They're pinned in on the peninsula. Can't go anywhere.
So he probably cut months, maybe years off the revolution by what he did.
Now, it's really cool. He liked Lafayette so much that he went back and got his name changed legally from James Armistead to James Lafayette. He loved Lafayette. And so Lafayette left America in 1784, went back to France. He came back here in 1824 for his farewell tour. Last time he's going to be in America. He's an old man. There's a painting of Lafayette that hangs inside the House chambers, the U.S. Congress, of Lafayette, the old man, on his farewell tour. And everywhere Lafayette went, there were hundreds of thousands of Americans lining the road. When he went through Richmond 40 years later, he looked over and spotted his old friend James right in the crowd. Picked him out, called him a name. They went and hugged and embraced, and it was really cool.
Why do we not know this story, because really, you talk to African Americans, and they'll say, well, I mean, I think I had Al Sharpton say this to me. Well, you give me somebody like Rosa Parks up there. He said this about these three gentlemen.
Yeah.
You get rid of all the white guys. You give me somebody like Rosa Parks up there. Why don't you have any color there? And that's what prompted this show. There is. Why leave people like this out?
Let me give you an example of how well we used to know this. You know, the painting you showed of Washington crossing the Delaware, this little jewel right here. You mentioned that this is Oliver Cromwell, and he is. But up here are Prince Whipple, but the other one's Oliver Cromwell. There's actually 2 blacks in the front of that boat. and they served not as slaves. They were free men who served with Washington on the general staff throughout the Revolution from start to finish. Now, this painting that you showed was done in 1851 by German, and it was done in Europe. It wasn't done in America. It was done in Europe to show the Europeans, here's what the American Revolution looked like, which meant back then we knew blacks were involved, whites were involved. At the back of the boat, there's actually a lady dressed up in men's clothes.
Put this back up. Put the George Washington crossing the Delaware over, because I find it interesting because I looked into the history of this as well.
See, they believe what he did was. Go ahead.
I heard this is the lady, but who are you saying?
Right there, right there. That's the lady.
Right here.
Right there.
Yeah,
and the two guys up front, the very front guy, Oliver Cromwell, and you pointed to Prince Whipple behind him there. I mean, this was done to show Europe, hey, here's what America did in the Revolution.
Right.
Everybody came together. We don't show that today. I mean, it used to be that we knew. This book right here is an old textbook from 1855. It's a great book. It's written by a black historian, a first black appointed federal office. It's called The Colored Patriots of the American Revolution. Now, we studied that as a textbook. That is not a skinny little book that we have there. I mean, there's a lot of patriots in the American Revolution that we studied. Black patriots.
I read the book Giants and was just amazed at this man, Frederick Douglass. Incredible guy. We don't really even know. Most people can say, I think the audience would say, yeah, I can I know that's Frederick Douglass, but you're not really sure. I mean, you're like, I don't really know his story, I think. Am I right saying that or not? You kind of know him, but you're not sure why.
Right.
Tell the story.
We've got a movie about Malcolm X, right? Movies about Martin Luther King Jr., and for some reason in American history we think that the only time blacks stood up for their rights was when Martin Luther King decided to leave the pulpit, hit the stump to make speeches. The bottom line is, for the longest time, we've adopted this victim narrative about blacks in the United States, that the only role they played was a victim to white majority oppression. When I teach my course on black American politics, I always stress to my students that when we talk about King and the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s, we need to call it the modern civil rights movement, because blacks from before the revolution were prudently pressing for their rights. American history could be described as one long civil rights struggle. Our first Emancipation Proclamation, Declaration of Independence.
That's right.
It's been this way. It's going on now. It's going on. It's people trying to grab others' rights, and that never changes. That's human history. That's human history. If I ask the audience, when did America have its first African American judge? What year would you say? Anybody? Take a guess. Judge. 1860s? Anybody? 1770. Amy, is that just a wild guess?
No, it's not. I wasn't sure exactly, but I think it's about
1770. Tell me.
1768. Wentworth Cheswell, New Hampshire, elected to office in New Hampshire.
Was reelected for the next 49 years, held 8 different political positions.
Really cool story about him is we all know that Paul Revere made his midnight ride. We also know he wasn't the only guy riding that night. Another guy riding, Wentworth Cheswell, black and white.
Now, how is it possible? Did you know that we had an African-American ride to say the British are coming, the British are coming? Amy did. Amy did. Anybody else besides Amy know that? 2, 3. Okay, 3 people in the audience. He was such a great guy, and we never hear about him because he rode north and Paul Revere rode west. And Revere was going after Reverend Jonas Clark's church because that's where Hancock and Adams were, was him. And that's where we had blacks and whites, as you pointed out, laying on the ground after that battle. Wentworth Cheswell rode north, telling people the British are coming. And it was from the north that all those people came to Boston to take on the British at Bunker Hill and everywhere else. So we don't hear about his ride because the British went west, and that's where all the action happened. But it was a couple of days later when all these people started coming down from New Hampshire and Vermont and elsewhere, and that's where he had ridden, telling them what was up. I want you to tell me a little bit about about Frederick Douglass. Sure. You know, the opening of Giants is so captivating, where you see a man who has struggled, who was kept. I mean, it sounds horrible to say, but kept in, I guess, nice slavery, if there's such a thing. How would you describe how he...
Well, he didn't grow up as a slave in the deep South, the deep cotton states. So, right. I mean, the phrase being sold down the river, that has an actual historical connection. To be sold down the river was the worst thing because you went from something pretty bad to awfully bad.
Right, okay.
So a slave in Maryland is not as bad as being a slave down in the Delta.
And what happened to his family where he was originally held? Because they sold him.
They sold him. He never knew his siblings, met his mother, or had vague memories of his mother maybe a few times. He remembers her calling him my little Valentine, and that's why he dates his birthday February 14th, but he doesn't have a birth certificate. He doesn't know when he was born.
Okay.
We think February 1818.
Okay, so he was in, a slavery that was northern slavery, but then he was sold into horrible, horrible conditions, and he witnessed for the first time somebody's whipping him, and he's like, whoa, 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 what is this all about? And it wasn't too much longer that he's sitting and having a conversation with Abraham Lincoln because he was so impressive. I think Frederick Douglass is a refounder, and we need more refounders. There are black founders. There are people that were here and played instrumental roles in the American idea and experiment. To be able to have African Americans watch this and say, oh, wait a minute, hang on. I haven't been told the truth. This is my country. There's such a disconnect prior to Abraham Lincoln. It's like the country for African Americans maybe was founded here, but that's not true. We have a man who was born in slavery, didn't know his family, horrible life, sold to another family. He's being whipped. And he doesn't even understand it. Correct me if I'm wrong, or if you can fill in any of the blanks. He doesn't even understand it. He's like, what are you doing? And whip him, whip him, whip him, try to break him. He runs away. He's sent back. Now they whip him within an inch of his life. He finally actually breaks the master, if I'm not mistaken.
The slave breaker, right.
Right, yeah. I think he's sold to another family where he finally is emancipated. Is that, I'm trying to remember this.
Well, he escapes for a second time. You're right. He tried to escape in 1836, I believe, and was caught in prison for a while, sent back, and then 2 years later just decides to try it again.
I'd rather die fighting for his freedom than to continue living as a slave.
And he succeeds in 1838.
Now, how does he, where does he go from there? How does he make this transition from slave to
here's the fellow who he gets in close with the Anti-Slavery Association, the American Anti-Slavery Society, and becomes a lecturer. And the story about that is his English is so good, people start saying there's no way Frederick Douglass could have been a slave because he speaks the King's English. I mean, it's so eloquent. He publishes his very famous now narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave, in 1845 to rave reviews, has to flee the country because he names names, his masters. What he doesn't do is he names the whites who helped him, because he wants to continue the Underground Railroad, as it were, for it to be successful. In fact, he's very critical of those who've been bragging about how they got out in this and that way. And he's like, look, you're not doing your brothers a favor here. So he has to flee to England, goes on tour there for 2 years, and it's British friends of his with maybe a few Americans
who pay for him to be free.
So they can return to the United States in 1847.
Okay, so he comes back. He takes a trip to Washington, D.C. I think he meets a general. I'm sorry, I'm so fuzzy on some of these details. I meant to brush up before I went on, and so I'm pulling this out of my memory here. But he goes to Washington. I think he meets a general, and the general is so impressed with him, says, you should serve. You should serve. And he says, absolutely, which was, if I'm not mistaken, unheard of at the time. And the general is so impressed, he says, you need to meet the president. And he walks him to the White House where he sits and they talk for 3 hours and they become friends.
This is the summer, this is August of 1863, the year of Jubilee, right? Emancipation, January 1st, 1863. He's there to complain to the president. He's one of Lincoln's fiercest critics, although a supporter, but one keeping Lincoln honest here. Now that he's got freedmen and free blacks serving in the Union Army and the Navy, he wants them to have equal pay. He wants them to be treated equally, get all the same treatment that white soldiers get. And Lincoln explains to him, look, we're just barely getting the country used to the idea of blacks serving in the military, let alone paying them equally. He makes the governor of Connecticut way down in the hall. Twice they come in and say, Mr. President, the governor of Connecticut is out here, and he says, I want to talk to my friend Frederick Douglass here. Meets with Douglass next year, August of '64. What's happening then? The war going very poorly. Lincoln, on record, does not believe he's going to be reelected. So why is he meeting with Frederick Douglass? Not just Frederick Douglass, but a second meeting, another meeting with Martin Delany, another black intellectual of the day. One plan. He says, McClellan gets elected, the Emancipation Proclamation is going out the window. You guys need to help me spirit as many slaves as possible across Union lines, because after March 4th, 1865, I will be no help to you. Thankfully, he gets that great telegram from Sherman in September. Atlanta is ours and fairly won. And of course, everybody's like, oh, I'm not against the war. I'm for the war. The war's going great. I'm for it.
Boy, we
wins.
haven't changed it all.
Yeah.
Jeez.
That's right.
We are just little worms. So,
but some of us are glowworms, to quote Winston Churchill.
All right, so there he is, but he goes back to meet and meet with Lincoln again later, and he's kept away from Lincoln.
Yeah, after the second inaugural address, Douglas was there. He sees it, and he figures, hey, there's a reception. There's no reason why I, an American citizen, can't see this elected president. He goes to the door, and they say, no colored people are allowed. And he says, there's no way that that order emanated from Mr. Lincoln. And so they say, okay, fine, come with me. So the two security guys bring Douglas in and then escort him out a window. They had planks on this window. There were so many people at the reception, they needed to find a way for them to get out. And he gets escorted out the window.
Wouldn't that be great if we could put those planks back up and we could escort people out the window?
So he walks the plank, and he finally gets word back to Lincoln. Lincoln sends for him. He comes across this great ballroom, the East Room, and he says, there's my friend, Mr. Douglas. Douglas comes to him, and Lincoln says to him, there's no man in this country whose opinion I value more. What did you think of my speech? And he said, Mr. Lincoln, that was a sacred effort. And that was the last time he saw him alive.
I want to go back to the Revolutionary time because African Americans played a critical role, And there is one thing that drives me out of my mind. I've heard presidents say it. And it is such a misjustice to our founders, such a miscast, and it cannot be anything other than intentional by people who are intelligent. But then again, I've seen how history has been distorted and changed. You may not even know the truth. Maybe I should give them the benefit of the doubt. They don't know the truth either. It is, I am only 3/5 of a man, and don't tell me about the founders. Let's correct that history. It is crucial to understanding, and it restores the founders and who they were. I want to go back to Frederick Douglass here, because Frederick Douglass actually was very upset at our founders because he said, I'm not just 3/5 of a human being, I'm a full human being. This is an argument that is used even today that Frederick Douglass corrected.
Yes.
Tell me the story.
What happened was, after he escaped in 1838, he ended up in New York. In New York, he gets discipled by a lot of anti-slavery folks, and that's the Lysander Spooners and Garrett Smith and William Lloyd Garrison, etc. And Massachusetts society hears him do his testimony, and they said, oh man, you got to speak for us. Well, in the meantime, they're saying, you know, you need to overthrow the Constitution because the Constitution is a slavery document. The founders gave us slavery in the document, and there's all these clauses of slavery. And he believed that. But bless his heart, when the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society said, we want to pay you to go on the road full time, he said, okay, I got to make sure I know this stuff. So he sat down and read the Constitution for himself, not just what the guys had taught him. He read it himself, and he read the documents surrounding it, the debates going around it. And he comes out with this epiphany and says, this is a great anti-slavery document. And he says, every clause in it. You go, whoa, time out. How can the 3/5 clause be an anti-slavery clause? Real easy. He read the convention notes. What happened was, you had all these anti-slavery founding fathers. You had, for example, James Wilson. You had Elbridge Sherry. You had Luther Martin.
Ben Franklin.
All these guys. All these anti-slavery guys. And you had 3 hardcore southern states that were pro-slavery. There's Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina. And so the Constitution says every 30,000 inhabitants you have, you get a representative to the House of Representatives. And in South Carolina and Georgia, there's more blacks than there are whites, and they're slaves. And they said, great, every 30,000 slaves we've got, we'll get another member of Congress. Guys up north said, no, 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 we're not doing that. If you want to count them, you free them. Every free person you have, you can get 30,000. You can have. And they said, no, no, we're going to count this, or we're not going to be part of these United States. So the debate goes back and forth. And what's really funny is the guys in the South said, you know, blacks are property. I love.
They're not people.
They're not people,
but they want to count them as people.
And see, the guys in the North said, no, every black is equal to a white. We're all created equal. You get 30,000 free blacks. You get a member of Congress, and that was the incentive to free blacks. It was, you get to count them for Congress. So the guys up north started having fun with the guys down south. They said, you know, you guys say that blacks are property, and Elbridge Gerry did this, and Luther Martin did it out of Maryland. They said, okay, here's what we're going to do up north: is you're counting 30,000 pieces of property to get a member of Congress. We're going to count 30,000 chairs and horses and cows. We'll count our property. Every 30,000 pieces of property we get an anti-slavery member to Congress. So they went back and forth on this thing, and what they finally ended up was the 3/5 clause that says, okay, we will count 3/5 of the slave population, not individuals, which meant you now had to have 50,000 before you could get a pro-slavery rep to Congress. The 3/5 clause cut the slavery representation in Congress in half. And when Frederick Douglass read that, he said, the 3/5 clause, that has nothing to do with worth. That has to do with the representation. It makes it harder to get a pro-slavery slavery representative in Congress, the Constitution's an anti-slavery document. And it was.
It was.
And
That's why they
Frederick
changed.
Douglass who points that out.
The original document for the Declaration of Independence was life, liberty, and property.
And property. That's right.
The reason being, they changed it. They changed it to pursuit of happiness because they didn't want the South to say, ah, ha, ha,
that's right. The South.
You've got chairs, we've got people. By the way, all of these people here, most people in these pictures, most people cannot identify them, but they all played a role in the founding of our nation, or the refounding of our nation. These people are now in the textbooks because of Texas, because of what happened. These people, they fought to put these people in. Why would the left fight to put these people in?
Let me go back to the picture we had earlier of the Battle of Bunker Hill.
Okay.
So if you take that picture of the Battle of Bunker Hill, and this is a painting that was done in 1817, and the guy who did this, John Trumbull, did this painting. John Trumbull was at the Battle of Bunker Hill. He's the guy who drew the maps for Washington, what went on. Over here on the right, we have Peter Salem. Now, he had 14 military commendations that day. He is the hero. They brought him in front of George Washington to get special honors from the commander-in-chief.
He's the guy standing behind the white guy with the sword.
That's right. Now, the white guy with the sword is Thomas Grosvenor. So you have Thomas Grosvenor and you have Peter Salem, black and white fighting side by side, but Peter is definitely the hero that day. 1817, this painting is done, and all the way up until the 1980s, we knew that that was Peter Salem, the hero of Bunker Hill. 1980s, the professors got together and said, oh, no, that's not Peter Salem. We think that that's Grosvenor's slave is who that is. It's not Peter Salem.
Oh, you're kidding.
No, in the 80s, they changed that from Peter Salem to Grosvenor's slave, Asaba. And that's what they say, no, no, it's not Peter, it's Asaba, Grosvenor, it's his slave. How come the guy who painted it and the guy who was there and the guy who saw it and painted what he saw had him as Peter Salem, and now we've all convinced, oh no, it's just like, because we're into this thing of the founders have got to be evil, we got to make every effort we can to make them evil, we got to make victims and everything. These guys weren't victims. They were courageous Americans who won the battle, and we can't afford to say that.
When did America have the first Speaker of the House?
1789.
Wow. First, one thing that I think is missing in America, and it is the key to America, has been the difference between individual rights and collective rights, and this man articulated that.
In a speech entitled Our Composite Nationality, Frederick Douglass said, I know of no rights of color superior to the rights of humanity. He thought the worst thing that could happen for blacks after the Civil War was to treat them as exceptions in the law. And so today, with the discursive logjam that we have over things like affirmative action and group rights, and the only thing that you get from government is if you ally with others who look like you or somehow are categorized like you.
This goes into your theory that this is why this is not being taught, because you can't play the victim card. If you don't...
It goes against the traditional victim narrative. After the Civil War, the history was actually written by the losers. That's one time in history where the losers wrote the history.
That's exactly right.
Really interesting perspective.
That's exactly right.
All right, David, explain quickly. Let's go through these people.
Let's go through these. This guy right here, this is Lemuel Haynes. Lemuel Haynes is a soldier in the American Revolution. He's a black preacher. He's the first black preacher ordained in America that was a pastor of a white congregation in Vermont, Massachusetts, New York, several places.
A black professor in
black
a
preacher.
That's
That's right, in a white church.
Yeah, black minister.
Black minister in a white church in 4 different states. He was ordained in the Congregationalist denomination in 1785. He's the first black to receive a master's degree in America. He got that in 1804 from Middlebury College. So Lemuel Haynes, every year on Washington's birthday, he preached a special sermon about George Washington, his commander-in-chief, in all of his churches where he was. So we don't hear about Lemuel Haynes. This is Benjamin Banneker. I think he's the most brilliant scientist in American history. This guy, unbelievable what he did. He's the guy
more so than Franklin?
I would put Franklin and Banneker almost equal.
Now, Franklin did a lot of inventions. This guy one time took a pocket watch. He taught himself how to read. He taught himself science. He wrote an almanac that 10 years ahead he was able to predict to the minute solar eclipses, lunar eclipses, 10 years before they happened. I mean, by watching the motion through a telescope, unbelievable what the guy did. He once took the back off a pocket watch, saw how it worked, went home and carved a wooden clock with all the gears, mainspring, and it was accurate to within 1 minute a year. A wooden clock the guy did. He's the guy who laid out Washington, D.C. He's the surveyor who did all that. He's a brilliant mathematician. Jefferson gave him...
Never knew this.
No. Jefferson gave him his example to France, said, hey, you guys in France think that blacks are inferior? Here's Benjamin Banneker.
Okay. On the scene, there was a survey in the most important project ever. Come on. Commissioned as a survey of the District of Columbia in 1789, and then appearance as an almanac maker in 1791, and chief surveyor and designer of the District of Columbia. How you gonna just pop up making almanacs, making ephemeruses? You're doing all this stuff, nobody don't even know you. That's because he was hiding his identity. 1793 almanac was the most widely read book in the colonies. You got a brother who published an almanac, the most widely read book in the colonies. And we have to change our concept of the slavery that was going on through that time. We were at war with them. Some of us were wise enough to know what was going on, so, like some people will tell you, might not explain it.
We made them temporary custodians holding on to some of the knowledge.
All right, and they know that. His activity before the first almanac. The only record they have of him from alleged birth, 1732 to 1789, when he first comes out, is some transactions at Ellicott Mill store in 1795, 1796, 1774, 1775, then in 1799. Besides that, you don't know who this dude is. Ellicott Mills was Andrew Ellicott, who worked on the surveying. Besides that, who was this dude? He had a special project. All right? Banneker was the secret Moor who designed the Republic. He gave them all the information, and he hid the cosmology inside of the science that he gave them. That's how you know it's ours. All right? And we're going to show you, they kept showing the picture of this Moor with George Washington everywhere he went. And the people who were Caucasians, who were assistants to George Washington, two of them were painters, they wrote about it. So you know they was right there on the spot, watching what was going on, and they painted pictures during that time period. So this is not some mythical history, that's what I'm trying to say. This is real history. Let's start off with this. Banneker is given the name Moses in a cartoon called Liberty Kids. Come on, every Sunday at 11 o'clock. And there was a book. Now, he's supposed to be the special assistant to Benjamin Franklin. The real works that are applied and given to Benjamin Franklin are really the works of Benjamin Banneker. And they're telling you secretly in cartoons and everything. You know how they communicate to them. Moses 72 was a book by a dude named Cecil Curry. Write it down. And what it was, the book is about Benjamin Franklin having a code name Moses 72. And being a secret double agent working on behalf of building the American Republic. Now, the number 72 has everything to do with Moorish cosmology. All right? When you get high up into it, you understand there's 72 years to a solar minute. The sun goes around Sirius in a circle. It's 360 degrees in a circle. When you take 360 and multiply it by 72, you get how long the Great Year takes, which is 25,920 years. And he left it right downtown. On the design for Washington, D.C. and Philadelphia. He left that science down. So he was the real person that was doing the work. And when you look at the cartoon, it's dropping how Moses was the assistant to Benjamin Franklin, and he was helping him do everything, postmaster work, all this stuff. They never tell you who he was, though. Just some dude. All right, so stuff on Benjamin Banneker and Franklin that lets you know that something fishy is going on. Both were self-taught scientists, inventors, astronomers, and farmers. Self-taught, had no formal education, while all these other people was going to Yale and all these other places. No record of them going to school. Both of them. Both were clockmakers. Had their own clock shops. You know, Banneker is given the history of making a clock, and you can prove that he knew the science by what he learned astronomically. All right? He was the one in his almanac that was talking about Sirius, Arcturus, and Spica, which Washington, D.C. and Philadelphia laid out on. Okay? It was him. That's in his almanacs. Banneker. Both published almanacs in Philadelphia. Both were abolitionists in Philadelphia. I'm saying both because there's no record of them meeting each other. Ever. Even though they met the same people. Like Benjamin Rush, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson. They met the same people, but there's no record of them coming into contact, and you're not going to find it. Go find it. I give you $1,000 on the spot if you find it. Franklin was the ambassador to France. Banneker sent his almanacs to France via Jefferson. They got it right in the letter to Jefferson. And he was connected to France through his connection to Pierre Lampont, the first high architect and designer of Washington, D.C. All right? There's other connections to France dealing with the French and Indian War and who were the Acadians. It's all connected back then. And it caused a revolution in France, but it went against the monarchy. Toussaint Louverture and all these other lords that were there, they were responding to something that was going on secretly. All right? The Grand Lodge of France was not in alignment with the Grand Lodge of England. Two Masonic groups. Better get this history. Franklin was the governor of the Sons of St. Tammany, a secret society for honoring Chief Tammany. I got it. Of the Abenaki. The Abenaki is the root word of Banneker or Bannaky Springs. And the Abenaki had had the three-branch system of government. So here you have the tribes who giving the information to the Americans to build a government. The etymology of the name of the tribe fits Banneker's name, and there was a whole confederacy called the Abenaki Confederacy. You can go look it up online. Wabanaki, they put W in front of it. The Wabanaki Confederacy was against the Iroquois. All right? Both were musicians that played the violin and harp. When they did findings, archaeological findings at Benjamin Banneker's home in Banneker Springs, which they burned down, both of them got their homes burned down, they found glasses, spectacles, bifocals, instruments. They found all the same stuff that's connected to both of them. And I said both had their houses demolished after their alleged deaths. All right? So there's a lot of stuff that people can argue on that. I'm not arguing. I'm arguing that the stuff that you're attributing to Benjamin Franklin is really Benjamin Banneker. More is going to come out. Zodiac of Banneker's almanac, showing the human body and its connection to the zodiac. The parts that each zodiac rules. Aries, the head. Taurus, the neck. And going all the way around to 12. The only other place that had a depiction of the human body's connection to the zodiac in America was Benjamin Franklin's almanac. All right? Gave the source, William Mill, Benjamin Franklin's printer. All right? So it's showing you which sign rules what part of the body. All right? Because we're spinning in the zodiac every day. Right now, we're in Sagittarius, which means Sagittarius, or Scorpio, excuse me, is rising on the horizon. Even though the monthly zodiac that we're in is Taurus, and the Earth is rotating, it's spinning through the zodiacs too. All right? As it's revolving around the sun, it's spinning through the zodiac. So we have to be aware of all those motions and the psychological impact that it has on human beings. All right, now this is an original portrait done in 1780. It's going to get bigger after we put it. By John Campbell, who was an assistant to George Washington. And he painted this in 1780. I ain't going to sketch this up at home and bring it to you. He painted it. And he said that it's Primus Hall, who was the son of Prince Hall. But Prince Hall don't have no son. At least there's no records for it. You go check Ancestry at Ancestry.com. You can get the records and you'll find out Prince Hall, his wife Delia Hall, are on there. There's no son. All right? And this was original portrait. This is George Washington in the background. You see your brother wearing a red turban with red on. George Washington has something, a paper in his hand, putting his finger to a red flag on the hill. With ships in the background, you can't see it when you see the picture. We have a printout with red flags on it. The Morris flag. So if that's Prince Hall, then is Prince Hall Benjamin Banneker? They're the same person. That's why you don't have no records on Prince Hall. That's why you got no records on Benjamin Banneker besides his almanac. Because there was something going on.
I have 2 minutes total, so
okay,
quickly
right
there, and then we have one.
Right here, James Armistead. We talked about the first double spy, really cool guy. This is Richard Allen. He's the first founder of a black denomination in America. He is a soldier in the American Revolution. He actually is the first guy to practice medicine, taught by sign of the Declaration, Dr. Benjamin Rush. Just a really cool story.
Okay.
So really cool.
All right, good. Now tell me.
Go to these guys.
Now let's take the full of the first representatives. I asked, when did we have our first black Speaker of the House? When did we have the first Speaker of the House? 1789. When did we have our first black Speaker of the House? I bet most people would say never.
Never. Except it was right here. Joseph Hayne Rainey. Joseph Hayne Rainey, South Carolina, is first black to preside over the House of Representatives. These are the first 7 blacks elected to Congress. You have here Senator Hiram Rhodes Revels, the first black U.S. senator elected. He was a minister of the gospel. He was a missionary. He worked with Frederick Douglass. He recruited 3 regiments of black soldiers in the Civil War, and he was a missionary to slaves in the South. You have here Benjamin Turner, Josiah Wall, the large. This guy right here is really cool. Robert Brown Elliott is probably the most brilliant guy of that era. He actually took on the vice president of the Confederacy in a debate on the floor and just tore his head off. The racist Alexander Stephens. It was a great debate.
When did we turn? Were these guys proud Americans, or did they say
this is the epitome of what we were just talking about. These were individual guys. Half of these guys taught themselves to read. Half of these guys were slaves, and 5 years later they're sitting in Congress. And as slaves, it was a capital offense to learn to read. read. So these guys in 5 years, and I'll guarantee you read their speeches and records of Congress, you better have a dictionary and a thesaurus in both hands because you want to understand the language they use. It is so brilliant what these guys did.
But were they there to say the white man is bad and the America is bad?
No.
And
these guys were, Richard Allen, let me go back here. Richard Allen had been in slavery. Richard Allen was in slavery, and he held no bitterness at all. He says, God would not allow bitterness even in Joseph when he was in prison. Do you think God will allow it in us? He said, we can't have bitterness. He said, by the way, there were some whites who held us in slavery, but it's whites who are working for our freedom. I mean, these guys had no bitterness. They wouldn't allow it.
When did this rich history get erased from the textbooks?
Lucas hit it. The losers wrote the history. I mean, that's exactly what happened. Was the loser wrote. You really said something, put it together for me, because my viewpoint was, and you're going to love this. This is red meat for you. Woodrow Wilson changed the teaching of history. So,
hate that guy.
Woodrow Wilson, when he came into office, he took every black in office in federal government and kicked them all out except one. He left one black in office. He
resegregated the army.
He resegregated. He's the first guy to show a film at the White House, and the film he showed was Birth of a Nation, a Klan recruiting film.
He called it history written with lightning.
That's right.
The NAACP, to their credit, boycotted that movie.
That's right. So he's the guy who wrote the 7-volume history of the American people. And that is the set that suddenly became the whole basis of the way we started teaching 20th century history. It's racist.
Oh, it's awful.
But
he has a PhD.
Rafiq.
Can you please explain to the audience that Texas is working to put this in their history books, is not trying to take out black history as the hype propagated by the media?
Yeah, the media doesn't like what we're doing. I was one of the 6 guys appointed in Texas to help oversee the writing, the standards, one of the experts, and we got every one of these guys back in, and it drives the left crazy.
Back in.
Yeah, back in. Back in. And you know, I love what you said, too, about groups versus individuals, because if you look at the American Revolution, not only was it black and white, guess what? We had a lot of Hispanic heroes as well, and it is such a good group. And the national motto is E pluribus unum. Out of many, we became one. And we have tried for 20 years to make it E unum pluribus. Out of one, we're going to be all these groups. And it's back.
Yes.
Good.
Well, what is the motivation behind not disseminating this information? What's the motivation behind the left or whoever it is that doesn't want this information put into the textbooks?
Well, their mentality is that you get what is secure if government gives it to you. The Declaration of Independence says your rights are not the gift of government. You are born with them. You are endowed by your Creator with these.
Right. Government exists to protect what you already possess.
That is counter 180 degrees to what the typical statist approach to government exists.
It really is slavery again. And you just start with the easiest to enslave, but it eventually ends in all of us being
It's a plantation mentality.
Yeah. Okay. Justice, go ahead.
How have these revelations of the Black Founding Fathers personally affected your viewpoints on the American government and society today?
I have to tell you, I didn't grow up in the civil rights movement. I grew up in Seattle, Washington, and so I've always kind of just approached it as everybody's, you know, hey, everybody has a fair shot. And I was one of your more uninformed people on planet Earth. In learning about the founders and seeing the heroes that were involved, it only strengthens my view that this was a divine document, the Declaration of Independence, that these guys really did struggle, just like in any society at any time. Bad guys, good guys. There were some real dirtbags. But for the most part, these guys were amazing, and they struggled in their time to do the right thing. You say that they're not Christians. They were Christians, and they fought for people who weren't. The same thing with, they were all white. Well, they fought for people who weren't. It was a confusing time, but an amazing time, because they were amazing people that had been forgotten. Remember them.
Woodrow Wilson was the professor. He was president of Princeton.
He was president of
Princeton University.
Governor of New York.
Democrat. An avowed racist. How exactly did all of this get expunged from history and he became sort of lionized? Scholarships for minorities after this man. Oh. And it's infuriating when you think about it.
I was just in a school. I
studied public policy, and I was I went to school with others that had this scholarship. I didn't get it, but others did.
Did you know who he was?
Not at that time.
Yeah, it's amazing. I was just in Salt Lake City, and I about had a car accident because I'm passing the Woodrow Wilson Elementary School. Yeah. I wanted to go in and take all the letters off. It's
right.
Wait.
These scholarships.
Public
for minorities
for public affairs.
For public affairs.
Public affairs. This is
propaganda.
This is propaganda. Yeah. If you read Goebbels' diary, okay, everybody knows that Hitler and the Nazis and Goebbels was the best. Read Goebbels' words. Goebbels says, "We lost to Woodrow Wilson. They had a better propaganda machine. That's why it's public affairs. He was a genius." on propaganda.
Yeah.
Evil, just evil.
But the whole thing was blacks were all Republicans, 100%. The first 190 blacks elected in South Carolina were all Republican. First 112 in Mississippi. First 137 in Louisiana. I mean, it's unbelievable. So that's where the Democrats side Wilson as a racist because they were racist.
Right. But you know, if you look at the history, it was the Republicans that changed it. Now, that's not to excuse Republicans who say that.
Yeah.
Not at all.
Yeah.
Because now a lot of them are progressives.
That's right.
It's the progressive movement that the evil came out of. And again, you don't know this because Wilson was a propaganda expert.
That's right.
Justice.
Would you label yourself as conservative? It's a part of the question.
Conservative libertarian.
Okay. Given the political views of the country today, there's raised a socioeconomic class where race is oftentimes attributed with class and therefore with politics. You mentioned the Ku Klux Klan was initiated in order to execute Republicans, and in essence there was race attributed with Republicans. All blacks are Republicans. In today's politics and in American government, what role would you say race and this striking of African American founding fathers plays in decision making?
Here's the answer to your question. It is time for Republicans and Democrats to stop playing black and white and start concentrating on the content of character, on merit, not color.
That's right.
Period.
That's right. That's right.
Who else? Yes, down here.
If you ever say to like a Democrat, for instance, you know, the Democrat Party was actually the party fighting for slavery, their typical response is no. Well, in the 30s, obviously the parties completely switched with the critical realignment. And then you read and you kind of realize that the parties didn't really switch. There wasn't really much of a switching, and more so the Democratic Party kind of just promised all of these things to blacks to shore up their political authority. So how much accuracy is really in that, and when the realignment happened in the 30s, and what is actually can be said about what happened.
Let me give you an example of how realignment didn't happen in the 30s. The 1964 Civil Rights Bill and the 1965 Voting Rights Act are the big things they point to. Both of those were written by Republicans, first by Eisenhower in '57, then again by Eisenhower in '59. It was the Democrat head of the Judiciary Committee that kept it from going through in the House and the Senate. We had talk about it, and actually JFK brought up Eisenhower's bills in '61, tried to get it. Then when he was killed, he gave a speech in '63 in Birmingham. Then he's killed, and then LBJ brings it up. So at the time he finally gets Eisenhower's bills to the floor for a vote, at that time in the House and the Senate, out of 535 House and Senate members, it takes a simple majority to get something done, 269. Democrats had 2/3 of the House, 2/3 of the Senate. No-brainer. They can pass this bill without any Republican support, and having 2/3 of the House and Senate, they could not marshal enough support to pass either the Voting Rights Act or the Civil Rights Act of '64-65. Only 62% of the 2/3 voted for that. It was actually the Republicans who voted about 83% for it, and had it not been for Republicans voting for Eisenhower's bill, you don't get either one of those. So realignment.
You know why they included women in the Civil Rights Act of '64? To kill the bill. To kill the bill. Hugh Davis Graham's history on this is, he says they put it in there because they said, oh, this is a slam dunk. There's no way this bill's going to get passed now. But the momentum had built up too much.
And then you pick up again the Walter Lippmann. Remember, Walter Lippmann was part of the propaganda machine from Wilson. You pick that machine up, which is now in all of the broadcasts, all of the journalist schools, and it's all erased. It's all erased. Go ahead. Yes.
No, what I was going to say is that liberal Democrats didn't jump on the civil rights train until it became politically convenient to do so. And the irony is that LBJ and JFK are lauded in the black community, but they didn't support the Civil Rights Act of 1957. A lot of people don't know that.
That's right.
Thanks, Bill.
Indeed, our ancestors taught the Europeans government. Again, although we have not had this information. Now, what do you mean our ancestors taught these people government? Which ancestors are you talking about? Some of the people who I just identified. The Wabanaki Confederacy is still in existence, and the people in it are not the original founders of it. Okay? Now I'm going to read a few things for you to verify some of this history that deals with the initiation of Caucasians. Now, the Bible and Quran, as we have talked about before, deal with the legacy of an ancient people who are called Israel. Israel, the word Israel comes from the Egyptian word Osiris, or Sare, Isra. That is the etymology and the origin of the word. It's found in two places, the Merenptah stele, which is a stele made in the 19th and 20th dynasties of Egypt, and in the pyramid text. But I want to read you some information from the people who were governing right prior to the Constitution under the Articles of Confederation. Everybody know what the Articles of Confederation is? Anybody know? Can somebody tell me what the Articles of Confederation are? Anybody know? It was the document of government prior to the Constitution that was changed in order to make the present Constitution. It was enacted and operated from 1781 to 1786. And there were 8 presidents in that time period prior to George Washington. And a lot of people are saying that they were black, but they weren't. They were Irish, and they were a part of a secret society called the Rosicrucians. And the Rosicrucians were the Germans who came over into America during the time period that Pennsylvania was being settled by William Penn, and they settled right up in Germantown. This is where you get the history of Germantown in Pennsylvania from. But I'm bringing that up because one of the presidents, whose name was Elias Boudinot, wrote a book called A Star in the West. And he talked about the native people who were here and how they were the lost tribes of Israel. And he talked about how they had the Bible in America prior to the European. Now this becomes very important because the so-called founding fathers who were under the Articles of Confederation have a secret connection to the society of people. Now, you know, we don't talk about secret societies and conspiracies. You hear about the Illuminati and all this stuff has become very popular. And people are just going all over the place with secret societies. But secret societies do rule your everyday affairs. Okay? But you have never known that there were black secret societies. You just hear about Rockefeller and Rothschild. But you haven't learned about your secret societies. Okay. This is his quote. Again, the book is A Star in the West by Elias Boudinot. And his quote is, he's talking about the Lenape, or the Nanticoke Moors. It is said amongst their principal or beloved men that they have it handed down from their ancestors that the book which the white people have was once theirs. Now the book that they're talking about is the Bible. The Bible is the history of the most ancient lineage on earth,
which is this Moorish or Israelite history.
A black history, or Israel,
meaning the people of Osiris.
Okay? It goes all the way back to ancient Nubia. All right? That while they had it, they prospered exceedingly. I'm talking about the history of the Bible. And the reason why I'm bringing this up also is because there was a European, Charles Thompson, who was the Secretary of Congress from 1774 to 1786. And he translated for the first time the original Septuagint, which is the Old Testament, right here in Philadelphia. And that translation that he has is completely different from your King James Version. There are specific verses that are missing. And he also knew that this lineage of people that he was translating the text about and that he had been initiated into right in Delaware were giving him information about a particular group of people who were here, who are being talked about by Mr. Elias Boudinot, the third president under the Articles of Confederation. So I'm trying to give you some context. That while they had it, they prospered exceedingly, but that the white people bought it from them and learned many things from it, while the natives lost their credit. Now, when did that happen? Most people do not know that the first time that the Old Testament was written down was in Egypt, 285 BC, under a pharaoh called Ptolemy Philadelphus. Now, it's interesting that you get this place named Philadelphia. 285 BC was the first time that the Bible was written down. Prior to that, there was no Bible except oral traditions. I know you don't believe that because you taught that Moses received the 5 books. That's a lie. You can verify it right in the Bible because he didn't write about his own death, which is recorded in Deuteronomy. Hebrew was not even a language when the biblical scholars say that Moses lived. And when we find out who Moses really was, then we understand where and why there's so much confusion. Because it's all related to this Moorish Israelite history
going all the way back to Kemet.
Am I confusing anyone? Okay, so the first time the Bible was written down is 285 BC under Ptolemy Philadelphus. And this was for the purpose of learning about a particular people in Egypt who had had their cartouches and history wiped out. And they are called the Amarna dynasty, 18th dynasty. And you find them mentioned in the Quran under Amran, the family of Amran, 3rd surah. Okay? And their lineage, as is recorded in the Bible and Quran, is Noah, or Nu. After the so-called climatic destructions on earth, then it leads to Abraham and the seed of Abraham. Okay? Now these people are real people. Right in Cairo Museum, if you are smart enough to get the information, which we have it in the book Reparations Equals War, they have Abraham's body. It is the best mummified and preserved body on earth. It has been mummified for 3,500 years. We'll go into detail further. Okay. So the white people bought it off them and learned many things from it while the Indians lost their credit. Offended the Great Spirit and suffered exceedingly from the neighboring nations, that the Great Spirit took pity on them and directed them to this country. So now what is being narrated is the movement of what I just showed you or talked about, the people of North Africa, the people of Kemet or Egypt, Tamaray, moving into West Africa and then moving further into North, South, and Central America. And if you look at the time period of the largest expeditions, they were taking place during the 2 time periods. This period of Israel with the Phoenicians, and then the period we know of as.
When you check the federal records, when you do the research on, even on histories of American religion documents in the Library of Congress, what you'll see, there's a common thread, and that is not only with the infiltration, with the COINTELPRO operations, because one of the focuses that they did with the COINTELPRO operations was taking into consideration that they would have difficulty having agents in all of different organizations. So the strategy, if you look at the FBI papers, is to infiltrate the orders and get people, mostly Christian ministers, to be leaders.
They did the same thing with God.
And then to neutralize the civic side of the operations. And this took place with both Marcus Garvey, Noble Drew Ali, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, and these are some of the things that Malcolm found out.
Now, I'm glad you mentioned Marcus Garvey, Taj. Didn't Marcus Garvey, his top soldiers, his generals, was Hebrew Israelites?
Yeah, and see, this is what you must know, and this is part of the dynamics of people really kind of understanding the true history, because you have Moorish Science Temple, then you have Moorish Hebrew, or what you call Moorish Jewish temples. See, the whole concept, I think, and we need to, how do you say, get information out to our people without them being sensitive to their belief systems and comprehend that we're all Hebrew. But it's not a religion the way it's presented, and we're not a different people. You deal with brothers and sisters from Hikupta who really know the history, and you know that all the priesthood know that Africa, what they call Egypt, is Hikupta. For sociologists, the word Egypt is used, which is a modern contemporary designation given by German scholars. But the proper name is Hikupta. And from Ptah, this is where you get Peter in the Bible. And a lot of it has to do with the misconceptions that the Europeans have perpetrated relative to Jews. There is no Jew. We're Yahudi. And the Yahudi are those of the Asiatics that crossed the river. And this has to do with the ancient Superdevir, the great Nexum Superdevir, and that is just like a survey. And this is where the land was divided between Ham and Cush, simply father and son. And in the principles, the Asiatics crossed the river. You know, the father crossed the river and left the land. And so when a lot of people look at the history, when they look at the Prince James versions of the Septuaginta, and who was later to become King James version of the Septuaginta, most of the people aren't even aware of the Septuaginta, and they won't even teach of the Septuaginta because most of them have been, how do you say, Constantinized, or modern Christianity. And so, yes, go ahead.
Would it be fair to say that the Moors of history and the Hebrews of history,
same people,
That's what I was going to ask.
This is one of the biggest frauds
Right.
that has come down the pike that causes divisions with our people. Look, even those dynamics.
Yes.
Even those dynamics. And what you'll find is most of the time that will come from people who come from what we have come to call schools of thought. However, when you go back into history, and this is one of the things that I recognize that's terribly injurious to us, even in our dealings with each other, which will demonstrate as soon as you see them getting together arguing dogma and calling it religion, because most of the masses don't get religion. And that's not an attack on anyone, that's just simply the truth. We are the same people. We, the Moors of the North Gate, are referred to as the Ibri, which some people call Hebrew. It is no Hebrew, it's Ibri. That's those of us who crossed the river. It cannot be emphasized enough. There is no difference between us and our brothers and sisters on the other side of the water after the land's separated, except some of us are mixed. Those who crossed the river are the Ibri, falsely called Hebrew. Hebrew is a modern corruption of Ibri. We are the Ibri. We're not different people. Problem, some of us know it has to do with the dividing of the land. Others, based on the way the Europeans have taught the books, think it's a different people with a different religion, with some kind of special relationship with the divine creator that nobody else has. When we're all brothers, sisters, cousins, and all of us can be traced to the same families. And what you find, it is really a reflection of what has been traditionally groomed amongst our people, which is self-hatred. Also, when you go back into the ancient culture of the Asiatics, you'll find that Moor and African are used synonymously throughout the world until about the 1600s. You know, and this includes people calling themselves whatever they want to call themselves. You understand? Even including the brands given by the Europeans. When you go back into the ancient world, you'll find that we were philosophical scientists. We were not what you would call dogmatists in the religious formats that you express today. As a matter of fact, in the not so much distant ancient world, mosques were universities. They were not places where you go pray, make salat, as you see traditionally now. Same thing with the synagogues.
It was school, court.
They were universities. You learned everything about life, from astrology, cosmology, philosophies, 7 liberal arts, agriculture, mathematics, calculus, etc., ephemerides, star charts, elements, metal tables, etc. As a matter of fact, even in our culture, Tetragrammaton actually deals with the 4 gates and the 4 elements. And yet Tetragrammaton is presented to people who don't understand it as the ineffable word or 4-letter word. You know, YHWH, and then those who don't understand the science just say Yahweh, you know, and then those who don't understand that say Jehovah. And yet those same people will turn around and condemn cosmology, which is actually the foundation of all religions on the planet. You get any bunch of our people, and they can go to any of these so-called nation states where their so-called beliefs are housed, whether you're talking about Yehudism, you know what I mean, Ibri, etc., Christianity, or Islam, etc. And you'll notice that every one of our people that claim to be black and stuff like that will be treated totally differently and not with the same respect as the other civilized human beings, including people who come here that may have the same so-called beliefs that we keep on trying to defend without having the knowledge of them, not even recognizing that half of them being tampered with. And that's not we're not condemning people. We're saying that people really need to study and stop identifying themselves with their belief system. They're dismissible. Let's talk about the bloodline, the brotherhood of man, the unity of our people, and the fundamental universal principles of philosophies that comprise religions across the planet that are based in divine laws of nature having nothing to do with belief systems whatsoever. And that's the religion distinguished from the dogmatism, which has to do with interrupted cultures where people are insecure and they make up stuff and add it under the name of Jesus, God, Allah, Muhammad in order to try to control other people either by mind control or some political agenda that has nothing to do with divine law. And furthermore, when you study it, half the stuff that people are debating about, if you examine the foundation of the major religions, you'll see most of it is dealing with dogma doctrine and not actually with the root principles of the religions. For instance, like you can ask most of them whether they're so-called Jews, claiming to be Jews, or Muslims, Christians, whatever, and just ask them to just express and explain the 7 Hermetic principles. And most of them can't get past 3. And some of them don't even get past 1. but they're going to tell you about the books. When all of the books, this is a fact, that's provable. All of those books where you're dealing with the Quran, Waspi, Torah, Tanakh, Pentateuch, Hexateuch, all of them are Kabbalistic in nature, entirely. Entirely. Now, imams know that, rabbis know that, and all reverend scholars know that. And all these same people that claim to believe in God believe in the devil, because they're preoccupied with fighting him with imaginary money and got an imaginary bank account at Chase Manhattan that they give Jesus his half, and usually the preacher's down Bahamas with Susie, but she's usually singing in the choir. Now, and I'm going to say this way. Do you notice how many people that are debating dogmatism, which is a counterfeit version of religion, they're arguing belief systems. And when people are really dealing with religion, they're not dealing with beliefs, they're dealing with knowledge. When those who really study cosmology and the religion of the world find out that it has, if anything, in relationship to ourselves, it has to do with the higher self and the lower self, nothing more. And most of them don't even know the Kabbalistic nature of the background of the religions that they claim to be a part of. And all you got to do is test them. No. And it's just like Freemasonry. When you hear people talk about Illuminati, you hear a lot of people in the name of being so-called religious condemning Brother Jay-Z and Sister Beyonce, Rihanna. That's their seal.
Is this evil?
No.
The goat sign?
No.
What does that mean, John?
Fertility. Ancient Africa, it means fertility. All over the world. Now, you know what it comes from? And this is provable. This is really provable. And this is when you know, when you hear people run around talking about, oh, we've studied ancient Kemet, right, and don't even recognize the symbols, including the symbol of civilization on the planet Earth, which is the Great Kunta, or what you call the pyramid, and calling it a sign of the devil. When they look at the sign of the goat and call it the devil, because the European through the Inquisition operations has referred to anything that is of Asiatic African descent as being satanic. And even all the scholars know that Satan is simply the planet Saturn. And that the devil is the word lived, put in a mirror, spelled backwards. And the priesthood controls the masses who don't study true history and law, keeps them under control with the mysticism of the devil.
Got them backwards.
And at the same time, they'll throw the word God around, don't even know it's a Germanic word, and it's not a noun, it's a verb transitive. So it means to call upon, let me finish, it means to call upon, to invoke, and to pour out. This is where you get the ritual of libation. It's an action, not a being. And the same ones that make that debate will turn around and say, well, Satan is the God of this world. Well, when they collecting finance for God, which one are they talking about? They don't start talking about big G's and little G's, please.
So are you an atheist? Do you believe in God, the higher power?
Sure, I believe in God. Aren't God in all of us? Tell me anything or any being that can't believe in God when God is the fact of your existence. But hold on. The concept and how it's presented is where the twist comes. Because most people throw it around assuming that it's the name of the supreme being creator, when it's a title applied to anything from drugs to dirt to evil to good to anything in between. And if you want to find somebody that's dangerous to you, you want to find somebody that's dangerous to your children, you want to find somebody that cast spells of evil on you, that wish you harm, find a believer that start throwing the word God around and judging everybody. And you'll usually find the most evil, vile, self-righteous, poisonous, and toxic and hateful people that the world has ever known. Wow. You ask the average Muslim, what do those 7 circles, that circle 7 around Kaaba, represent? Aside from the mathematics, from the ritual that is done with the body that represents the mathematics of the transits of the planets. Ask them the value measurement symbolic of each one of those counter rotations around the cube, which is Kaaba. And then ask them what is Kabbalism. And most of them will start talking about that's sure, it's the devil. Right. But yet the ritual represents the rotationary orbital planes of the 7 ruling planets. And the meteorite within the Kaaba represents that we weren't always on this particular planet. And in the other corner is a woman buried. And Allah is a feminine name. Now, and all of your African deities, your ancient African deities are feminine. And so what you find is people sitting around debating their beliefs that have nothing to do with the science of life. And so the masses today have what you call club belief systems. And if you really pay attention to many of our people, and it's really unfortunate, and I don't condemn them, I'm just observing. And watch us. you'll find that one of the greatest damaging aspects of our fallen culture here in North America with the Asiatics, people of Asiatic African birth, is that they have fallen into the trickster psychology of European divisionism, and they identify themselves by their belief systems, not by their blood. As a matter of fact, they don't recognize nationhood nor bloodline, which of course is why, if you'll pay attention to us, our people hide behind their so-called beliefs for this imitation power that none of us possess. The power that we actually need in our unity. The power that we actually lost for having become divided with our banal belief systems, most of which, when traced back, have no foundation rooted in the original Zoroaster culture. Or the original principles of Islam and Yahudi, or what you call the philosophies, which are actually Gnostic and cosmological philosophies, the metaphysical microcosm, macrocosm elements of the earth study, and the ephemeritis by which we guide government.
How do you make that connection between the Kemetic people, the Moors, and the Hebrew? How?
It's like a Chinese talking about what's the difference between Chinese and light-skinned yellow people and dark-skinned yellow people. The fact of it is no such thing as light-skinned yellow people and dark-skinned yellow people. They're Chinese or Manchurian. How about that? And this goes the same thing with our people identifying their belief systems as their bloodline identity, which is an indication that they don't even know fundamental civilization. However, that's not a condemnation. Anybody that knows civilization understands that that's a flaw. And of course, that comes from European socialization, where, as you will pay attention to, our people distinguish some of these same people that claim the so-called spiritual knowledge don't even know that spirit refers to breath alone. And the philosophies, the Gnostic philosophies, constitutes the religion. One of the biggest frauds that I keep hearing is that the Kemetic people and the Moors are two different people.
That's what I'm talking
about. That's a fraud. In other words, the foundation is a fraud, but it's also an indication that somebody does not know history and someone does not know bloodline. As an example, when Rahm Emanuel, who was in what you call contemporary times, a Jew, as you would say, and we know it's actually Yahudi, left the Obama administration and he went to run for mayor in Chicago, which is a sister city of Mecca. On December the 22nd of 2011, he issued a proclamation acknowledging both Noble Ali, the history of the Moors, and the traverse here. Keep in mind that the civilized world has been appealing to the Asiatics of the Northwest for quite, more or less publicly, since about the 40s, late 40s, to nationalize. If you deal with the rights of indigenous people, which is recent, which Obama signed, if you deal with the Universal Proclamation of Human Rights, the rights of a child in 1959. And treaty enforcement under Bill Clinton, ETC. you'll find that the civilized world has consistently presented
to our people here in North America to nationalize
in all of those public laws, but yet, even in accord with the International Forum, it is given that all civic organizations, all church organizations, etc., community organizations, are to distribute that information at all costs. And as you can see, there's a perception out there in the public that only the active Moors are doing this thing as if it's our agenda, and it's the agenda of the world, including with all of these persons who are sitting around debating these things that are not debatable. I would appeal that we would do better for each other. And I would say that every one of them should have a Septuaginta. Septuaginta is the first Bibles. Okay. So if you or I are going to be a scholar and talk about we're going to debate this book, we should certainly know its foundation, shouldn't we? Mm-hmm. And then know that that came from the Book of the Dead. Mm-hmm. And that these Kabbalistic processes repeat themselves. This is nothing new.
What was this side of the landmass considered or called? Like North, South, and Central, I would say United States.
The ancient records, it was called Al-Maghreb Al-Aqsa, which is the Morocco of the farthest west. Okay. That's what it was in the old maps of our old empire, those of us that was in it, or descendants from it. And over here in the United States, there was those of us that were ancestrally always here. Okay. And periodically through the ages, both when the continents were together and when they were apart, we always communicated and did business or whatever, what have you, with each other. Okay. This empire spanned the world and was really great at points, and as it started to decline, it had to go into some sort of receivership. So out of that, empires, kingdoms, and dominions came nations, countries, and states. The United States is not America. America represents the United States of America in Congress assembled. That represents the Republic, in General Congress assembled or Congress assembled. That represents the Republic. So the Republic is the representative form of government of the American citizen who is independent of all foreign international controversies due to the fact that they or we have consolidated ourselves as a people. We, being melanated people, Moors, we also are from the aspect of the country that was a part of the old Moorish Empire, which makes us particularly significant because we then are the inheritors of both the American Republic and the old Moorish Empire, consolidated in us today as Moorish American nationals. But not all Moors understand the international aspect of their nationality because they have been domesticated to believe that they are only regaled to Moorish science from the perspective of our prophet Noble Jew Ali, meaning that Moors began with Noble Jew Ali and ended with him. And that's not true. He never said that. What happened was there was a great schism between our nation between 1699 and 1774. Our nation became divided. And so we had to consolidate what the nation was.
When you said our nation, who was running it?
This represents the people who made up the Continental Congress.
So it was a group of people, it was a body, it wasn't just one.
It was an ecclesiastical body, politic, and corporate. So out of that we had the 5 civilized tribes, as they call it. And out of the 5 civilized tribes, they descended from the, they came out of the Union of the 6 Nations. Out of them came the Union of the 6 Nations. Out of the Union of the 6 Nations came the Iroquois Confederacy. Out of the Iroquois Confederacy came the Articles of Association, which then led to the Articles of Confederation, which then created the Confederated or the Confederate Congress, out of which then came the United States of America and General Congress assembled, out of which then came America, out of then which came the United States. Yeah. So essentially, the people that they call native people, or what they want to call Indians, is not the real designation. Those people ancestrally were always referred to as the Almarcanos, because they descended out of what people call the Olmec people. The Olmec people is the older people that was here before everybody. The Olmec people hooked up with the ancient Ixi or Ix people out of the ancient Xiang dynasty in what they now call Asia or China. And they came over here and they hooked up and consolidated the empire right around the time that Hanno Bay on the northern side came over and set up the Carthaginian Empire and consolidated all of them together. And those empires moved throughout time here, throughout North Central South America, created a trade route, trade lines, all of that. But it wasn't until around the 1600s that the Olmecs had, Olmec, Maya, and Inca had reconsolidated themselves as what we call the Washita people. And out of the Washita people came sub-nations like the Northern Cree, the Southern Cree, the Sauk, and the Yamasee, which was a part of the old Olmecan Empire, and set themselves up in Georgia as their own government, own people. They all went to war. There was intermittent conflict between the 1600s over here and the late 1700s. So much conflict that the Northern Cree, the Southern Cree, attacked the Yamasee. And in doing that, when they won, they took all the Yamasee females and married them. And then another nation was created. These are the people we call the Seminole. And then they were given the land down in the Isle of Flowers, Florida. This perpetual war amongst them violated what we used to call the Great Law of Dianoshkua, which is Islam, over here. And based on that, our nation became divided between 1660 and 1774. So by 1774, we reconsolidate the union of the six nations, the 5 civilized tribes, the Iroquois Confederacy, what they also call the Algonquin Confederacy, which is erroneous because Algonquin is a dialect, it can't be a people, and consolidated that in a full faith and credit system that we refer to as the United States of America in Congress Assembly. And they agreed to set up a subcontracting division corporation called the United States that was compiled of a bunch of civil servants, slaves that were enslaved from what we call Albion, what today now they call London, which is over there. But in 1700s, London, or New England, was the 13 colonies, which was under the jurisdiction of a group of Moors over here called the Lenape, also referred to as the Delaware Indians, erroneously after General Delaware. But they were the ones who flew the Union Jack. That was an original flag that was here from here, that we call the British flag or the flag of the United Kingdom. The original United Kingdom was that of the Moors from Albion over there and the Delaware Lenape Moors from over here. That's why William Penn, in his writings, you read him, he says that when he came over here, he found the Moors, the Bays, speaking the King's English. So the same Moors left over there, he came over here, but they cousins, that's us, that's the amount of commerce. Everything that you read from the United States, right, is technically a redistribution of information that was left over from the previous government. This United States government, as you understand it to be, is really only about 240 years old. Well, look at it like this. The country is 239 years old. It's been at war for 222 of those years. So that should let you know that any place that is perpetually at war cannot be a country. Therefore, everything that's being done or executed as a country is done under a military or war amendment. A war amendment is something that was established during a war and was supposed to go back to peacetime, and the amendments are done. The war amendments are done after the war's over. However, in the United States, every president that becomes president of the United States has to perpetually sign in the state of emergency upon their first official act. They got to reinstate the same emergency that started from the Civil War that really started amongst the Cherokee people, the original Cherokee nations. There's a book you can get called Confederate Cherokees, the story of John Drew's regiment. John Drew, people didn't know, that's Noble Joe Ali's father, bless the prophet. And he had a lieutenant in his army who used to take orders from him, who was named Albert Pike. Albert Pike is the guy who, after the Confederacy War, started the whole KKK thing, as well as rewrote the pseudo-Masonry doctrine and injected all the Luciferian and Satanism and heavy homosexuality into it through his morals and dogma. Well, yeah, Masonry existed, and it existed as a means of, anciently, it was used as a means by our people to civilize people who weren't a part of our nation, and to give them forms of deep sciences that were passed down to us orally, but was given to them through symbology. So it was always a tool of civilization. It's never really a means to go in. So the war amendments that was already signed in are all the amendments that really started with the 13th. The 13th Amendment, once it was finally ratified, the 13th Amendment with the 20th sections, this is what they killed Abraham Lincoln for, because that reestablished the fact that those people who were outside of the United States after the war now had the right to go back to their own country. Their own country at this time was the previous government that preceded the United States. So to block that, they got a bunch of Christian preachers, black Christian preachers, to bribe them, as well as they got a group of white women, a order of white women they refer to as the Daughters of the American Revolution, and they got them to seduce and sleep with a lot of legislative aspects of Moors from the old republic, so that way they could dilute them, and therefore they would not go back to their own country, because now they were perpetually stuck in the United States, whether it be by marriage, contract,
year was this?
whatever. This is between 1854 and 1899.
And why was that an important time?
This was an important time because this represented Reconstruction, the Reconstructional history that was put forth on the world, where for instance, the Mercator map, the map that is totally wrong, where it's got Greenland twice the size of Africa, all that stuff, all of the miseducation about people, black people coming from monkeys, all of this happened through Reconstruction, through the Reconstructional period of history. There was the Reconquista, then it was the Renaissance, then it was the Reconstruction, right? Then it was the Revolution.
And you're saying that these things took place in specific periods of time,
between 14, yes.
Disintegrate, to dilute, and
to put everybody in a perpetual state of war, by which the United States could claim jurisdiction through war amendments like the 14th Amendment.
Okay, so what is the difference between the 14th Amendment and that?
The 14th Amendment is something that was used to describe aliens, meaning the new history that was being brought up, where black people all came as slaves from Africa. Anybody that subscribed to that understanding or that history, and not their own history, meaning them being born here and never coming from that place they call Africa, those people now were put under an alien aspect, meaning that they were made foreign to the land that they was born from. That's what the 14th Amendment did to blacks, Negroes, coloreds, and people who claim descent from the continent of Africa.
And so what is the difference?
African Americans.
And what is the difference between a citizen and a national?
A national is a descendant of the true American citizens who existed prior to the establishment of the 13 colonies. The 13 colonies themselves were, at the time, the only place where the world, where everybody understood the word or world England to be. So when we think of the 13 colonies between the 1700s and the mid 1800s, we're talking about, England at that time, we're talking about the 13 colonies. There was no place called England over there in the 1700s. That place was called Albion. So that means then that when you talk about New England, or you talk about England in the 1700s, 13 colonies, the Lord Proprietors of the colonies, those who made the deals with the Delaware Lenape, the original so-called British, the people who really had the Union Jack flag. All of that was over here. So what they did was made us foreign to ourselves, based upon the fact that we were always born here, but they made us believe that we were imported as slaves from a place called Africa, which then put us in an inferior position, which took us out of the national position. The national position being that we as Americans, we were always descended from the people who was from over here. There's no record of me. If you can't have no record, I can't be African American if you can't label where in Africa I'm really from. If you call me an African American, you're calling me two continents. You're not calling me an individual. It's not like saying I'm an Irish American, because an Irish American could go back to Ireland. An Italian American go back to Italy. A Moorish American is significantly tied to the Moorish experience and the Moorish Empire, which was a global empire but had a consolidated central government over here that reconsolidated itself as the United States of America in General Congress Assembly. Anybody that's on the physical landmass of the United States is in Alamanos Estados, aka
whether they
the
know
American
it or not.
continent.
But you have to understand that sounds crazy because not a lot of people.
I'm going to explain why.
Okay.
The continental United States, right? That represents North, Central, South America. That's the land, everything on it and in it. The corporate United States, the corporate jurisdiction, is all of the businesses that were incorporated through the Roman Curia in 1871 under the title United States of America, Inc., which is filed as a corporation in Lloyd's Bank of London right now, that is officially bankrupt, that has now went into receivership and has now been made a disregarded entity by the same Roman Curia that incorporated it, i.e. the Vatican. Through the motu proprio, the Vatican put out an edict that said that the United States and any corporation that's attached to it is no longer backed by any lawful law in the world. That everybody that lists themselves as a public official or a public servant is then by definition a criminal. This is their CEO. This is the CEO of every corporation.
What translation in
That means that every cop, every judge, every lawyer, every whoever, anybody in any municipal federal system technically is a criminal.
Wow.
Based upon the Pope telling them that, as he has disregarded all of the Western world or the Western European corporations, he's disregarded them totally. They don't exist anymore. So they've all been kind of, put out.
Okay.
So as they've been put out, they've now created a vacuum. It's a power vacuum now, where nobody is co-signing Western technologies, Western finances, based upon anything connected to the United States. Because everything connected to the United States, so-called government, is coming out of Washington. That's the only place where the United States exists. It doesn't exist anywhere else. It only exists outside
or just
Washington, D.C.
Wow.
It doesn't exist anywhere else. Actually, Virginia just took land back from D.C., so it's actually not even a 10-mile square of its main radius. It's actually now more like 6 miles within the general D.C. area. That's the only place where the United States exists. That's it.
So this is...
The only reason why it exists anywhere else is because they extended the corporate colorable jurisdiction through getting people to sign up under terms like white, black, African, West Indian, Hispanic, and then they get incorporated into the United States through the 14th Amendment, which is a war amendment. People wrote and asked me, well, what does that really mean? A war amendment nowadays would be something like an executive order. So upon the inauguration and the swearing in of the so-called president of these United States, notice I said these United States. These United States is different from the several states or the Union States. As you can tell, the United States is an ambiguous term because it can mean 10 different things. But essentially, in the case of what we're talking about for war amendments, that is applied strictly to the United States. When the Republican form of government was somewhat overthrown, it happened during the time that the Continental Congress, or what we refer to as the United States of America and General Congress assembled, went into what's called sine die, or sine die, which means adjourned to a later date. And while that was to take place, the administrative corporate so-called federal government was going to take over and hold it down on the administrative end. They took out a loan to do this. They took out an enterprise to do this themselves, even though they weren't a country. You got to remember, they declared their so-called, how they say it is that they went through a war of independence in 1776 and then fought really hard until 1777. And most people who don't know believe then that the country was then founded. But you got to remember, at the time that this went down, there was no United States of America. There was no United States. You understand? There was no jurisdiction for which the United States to propel itself into a centralized government for itself. Therefore, it had to come out of something. And that something predated it. That is what's called in law or American jurisprudence the precept. The precept is anything that came before. And therefore, the precept is us. So because we are the descendants of the original constituency of the so-called Republic of the United States of America General Congress Assembled, a.k.a. the Iroquois Confederacy, a.k.a. the Union of the Six Nations, a.k.a. the Republic, a.k.a. the Old Moorish Empire, we are ancestrally the truest American citizens because it was us, according to George Washington. When you look at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier in Washington, it basically alludes to us having expelled so much energy to help create a system by which was supposed to hold us down while we got our own individual stuff together. That then system turned against us because once the compact came through, the compact was what they call the more perfect union. The more perfect union started from the Articles of Association that went into the Articles of Confederation, that then went into the United States of America General Congress Assembled, what we call the Continental Congress.
Around what year?
This is between 1321 and 1774. The reason why we as the Moors were able to have a global empire was because one of our illustrious ancestors, Kankan Musa Bey, traveled across the entire region of Africa on his Hajj to Mecca, and he dropped so much gold that he depreciated all the markets, meaning that he bought up every market that he went through because there was no other money that was sufficient enough to hold up to his. So in that, he put the down payment on what became the then Moorish Malian Empire that extended from the western portion of Mali up into the Barbary states, over into what we call España, further up into the southern Pyrenees, which is southern France, back over to what we call Greenland, back down into Alaska, North Central South America. So all of these records is there. All these people know that that's what it is. It's just that we, as the original constituency, have to be unmade to know that, because then that would explain why so many of us is getting popped in the head and killed and stuff like that. Because the more that they can lock people up before they realize who they are and take control of their estates, the more that they can murder and ritualistically kill people and things like that before they realize their estates, before they realize that all of these black people, their melanin is being harvested. That's why melanin is $335 per gram on the NASDAQ and things like that. Like, you gotta understand, nothing is wasted when it comes to you because you are the basis of everything. 14th Amendment, which is a war amendment, which then makes them basically hostiles on United States territory. And the United States now has listed since, I think, the Clinton era, that the whole country is a battleground because the United States is being forced now to reduce itself back to its original jurisdiction. And that's what the Pope is coming here to do because he ain't got no choice.
So to seal this up,
he's going to all the original capitals of our republic. It's a wrap. So those of us that don't have a nationality should get one. The United States, through George Washington, agreed to pay a certain amount of money to King George and them at the capitulation of Cornwallis to cease the hostilities, as well as the fact they had to pay money to the national general government that they didn't have to pay. So the national government created a position by which the national government, our people, the several states, the Confederated Congress, the Continental Congress, the Iroquois Confederacy, the Union of the Six Nations, the 5 civilized tribes, okay, you get it? The Moorish Empire, right? The Alamanicanos Estados, you get it? So all of those people consolidated themselves together and manifested a perpetual trust, and that trust was put forth in the name of the United States of America and General Congress assembled. And then when this so-called fictitious federal state came up to take that position, it now had to take the weight of the fact that it did not have money to support its position as its own government. So it had to work for us up until they forfeited on the debt to England. And that's why in the War of 1812, they came and burned the Library of Congress down. George Thomas Jefferson upped the insurance on it the year before, and then they were able to start the reconstructive history from there. Because up until that point, when you read the constitutional papers and stuff, it basically says that everything is about republic. Once the republic thing, the Federalists, it was anti-federalist. When Jefferson came and introduced the democratic or demonstrative or demonstrative or democratic party, what he was doing was now setting that up to have the position to the face to look like it's there to help people, but behind the scenes is something else. That's why the ass or the donkey was used as a symbol for the Democratic Party, whereas the Republic was manifested or symbolized by the elephant, because that's the symbol of Hannibal, as well as Ganesh, as well as the old Moorish Empire of Alamanicanos Estados, established over here under Hannibal Bay, verified by the Bornstone in Chesapeake Bay, which basically positions this part of the world as connected to the old Grand Moorish Empire from time immemorial. So what our ancestors were then, we are today, and the only way they can get you to not be that is to accept an inferior designation, which would put you under their trusteeship, which then gives them the right to manage you. So if you don't want to be managed as an original Asiatic person, aka a Moorish American national, you have to understand what position you are really in, not only historically, but also ancestrally. The Pope is coming here, and he's only going to the historic capitals of the United States. Anytime you use historic capital of the United States of America, they're talking about you and your republic. Because what we have to understand is, as Moors, we are the aboriginal white people. Go online and look up the definition under the Racial Code Index of what it takes to be a white person in the United States. And that means, when you read the definition, it says that you have to be of North African ancestry. So I don't know how somebody like George Bush could be more North African than me. You dig what I'm saying? Because he's listed as white. But he's only listed as white through the trusteeship that his ancestors set up for him. Because all of these Caucasian people are descended from a race of Caucasian people that were domesticated in the greater Moorish Empire under the Ottomans, under a system called the Janissary, that eventually developed into a Mameluke system by which you had Caucasian people who were raised up under Islam and used as soldiers of war to enslave other Caucasian people on behalf of the empire, so we wouldn't have to lose our people. And in the process of that, they were given limited dominion. These were called days. So these days set up what were called delegates. This is where you get the term delegate from. And the delegates is where the Caucasian slaves would be matured, so that way when people came from different parts of the empire to buy one, you know, they would already be made to know how to fight, things like that. And then Moors started to use these Mamelukes against each other, in wars against each other, so that way they could disinherit and fight each other through proxy. So the same thing is going on today. The same way if I had a problem with you and you had a problem with me, you go to the police. See what I'm saying? So they occupied that position, not us, but this is what people do. You know what I'm saying? Exactly, because you know people take it literal. So based on that, we, again, on one side are the descendants of the original republic. On the other side, we're descendants of the old Moorish Empire that helped spawn the republic from 1321. So therefore, like I said, when Khan Musa, locked everything down with the gold, that was the down payment. So that way, perpetually, wherever the Moors went throughout the world, our credit was good. We could work in full faith and credit. That system was transliterated between 1321 and 1774 into the United States of America and General Commerce Assembly. That's why the Sultan had to be consulted before they did anything, before anybody else in the world recognized it. That's why they had to assure the Sultan that he was going to get his money and all that stuff back after he had vouched for them to the Basha of Tunis and Algiers. So that put them in a perpetual debt they could never pay. So in that, the United States of America and General Commerce Assembly was able to now write checks or whatever in the name of the United States, and the United States would have to pay the money back, which they never had the money to do. I don't know if you've seen in the news recently, there was a Native American, so-called Native American tribe that has adopted 14+ million, or allegedly wants to adopt 14 million so-called white people into their ranks. Now, a lot of these same nations that's trying to do that, these are the same nations now that basically put out an edict before where they were trying to get rid of all of the so-called black or slave descendant Cherokees out of the so-called Cherokee Nation. The Supreme Court found that to be illegal, and based on that now they had to allow them back in. The problem with that is that we have to understand that how we come into something is usually how we leave it. So what they want us to believe is that tribes like the Cherokee and the Seminole and these people like that were so-called phenotypically looking like the so-called Native Americans that existed after 1899, when we know that that's not really true. We know the original Chata Nation, the original Charatagi, the original Mesquite, or what they call Muskogee, Narragansett, Nanticoke, Delaware, Montauk, Abenaki, Wabanaki, all of these so-called clans and tribes or nations were all Muslims prior to 1899. Don't let them fool you. Don't let them make you think that they wasn't Moors. Don't let them make you think that they were not the Alamadacanos or Stados. They were that. The problem was, after 1899, most of these people that you see as Native American and a lot of these powwows and stuff, a lot of these people got that understanding of what it means to so-called be Indian, right? After and based on the Buffalo Bill's Wild Wild West show. And this was a show just like Birth of a Nation. How you had Birth of a Nation come out and basically promote the KKK that led to over, 200 and some odd years of brutal terrorism. The same thing happened with the Buffalo Bill Wild Wild West show in making a lot of people believe that they were actually more native than they really were.
Kind of like how Hollywood does now.
Exactly. Exactly. How they did with Exodus, Gods of Egypt, where everybody that's doing the work in so-called Egypt is so-called melanated, but then the ruling class all happen to be white people who at the time, or if this really did happen, they were in the caves and stuff like that. What we have to understand is that there is an old adage that says those who do not know their history will be doomed to repeat it. And so what's happening now is that there's a revisionist history going on where they want us to believe that, again, not only do we come from Africa, but worse, that we were slaves here in this country, when really that's not really how it all went down. That's not everybody's story. But for some reason, if you're this color, that's what is supposed to be your story, regardless of whether you was born here or not. And that is a problem, because what that does is it gives us a false sense of inferiority, and it gives another people a false sense of superiority. When these people that they talk about who are Native Americans and Grand Chieftains today, talking about the ones that's opening the casinos and all this other stuff, they are all descendants of people from Tartary. And how can we prove this? This is because way back in the days, there was an empire in ancient China called the Xiang Dynasty. And the Xiang decided, under a man named Hu Xian, another Moor, decided to come over here and find their cousins, who they refer to as the Western Ixi, or Ixec, or Yi. And so when they came here, they found an Olmecs here that was already here from time immemorial, and they both merged their culture. When that culture merged together, they became one people. And then out of that people, we get the people today we call the Hopi, the Anasazi, the so-called Pueblo cultures, and all of that, right? It wasn't until maybe 16,000 years later, when the Hindus was exiled from India by the Sindhi Moors, or the Moors from Old Bombay and all of that, kicked them out. After the Hindu invasions, they all was brought over in boats and brought over here. When they came here, they then mixed with the so-called Autochthon or Aboriginal people who were already here, and then those Aboriginal people allowed them to stay in a certain area. And they adopted them into certain aspects of the culture. This is where you get people called the Mixtecs and the Zapotecs and the Toltecs and these type of people. They were all descended from the Olmecs. Now the Olmec people, the original constituency, started to move further up. They started to move further up from La Venta, Palenque, Chichen Itza, and moved further up into what we would now call the Midwestern United States, and then further, and then after a certain amount of time, they dwelled there and then started to disperse into sub-tribes and nations. Some of those sub-tribes and nations, one of the biggest one was called the Yamasee. I don't know if any people saw the movie Apocalypto, but in that movie there was a blue dye that they were painting the people who were going to be sacrificed in. That blue dye actually comes from red clay that's found in Georgia, the red clay in Georgia. And it was an old custom that the queens would ingest some of the red clay in Georgia because it would help with the magical properties that they were trying to pass on to the babes. And a lot of Algonquin people still do that to this day. So what happened was the Yamasee nation established themselves in what we call Georgia. And then one of the sub-nations called the Southern Cree and then the Northern Creek decided to go against and fight the Yamasee. There was a big war between that, and then the Yamasee basically lost the war, and their women were then brought in as squaws, meaning captured queens, to populate with the Cree, the Northern Cree, and the Southern Creek. And once they had those babies, that became another nation now. That nation was then known as the Seminole. And then the Seminole were then given land back down in what we right here call Al-Andalusia, and they came back down here. That's why around the time of Santa Anna, Santa Anna, who was the Moor that ruled Older Mexico, that's why when the Seminoles agreed to go back to Mexico, it was okay because that was the ancient ancestral lands of their forefathers, the so-called Olmecs in there. But what modern history today has told us is that the word Seminole means runaway slave. And so the so-called ancient Big Buffalo people, that's another name for us, the Big Buffalo people, the ancient bison riders is what they used to call us. All of that history was then redone and reconstructed between the years of Manifest Destiny, let's say around 1854 to, let's say, 1899. And after Reconstruction stopped with Rutherford B. Hayes. And then in that, then they started to supplant the fact that anybody dark-skinned was basically a slave from Africa, which is not true. And anybody who was of the reddish hue or mixed with us, right, who could trace their descendancy back to the Olmecs, those people had to be wiped out. So you have to understand, between 1492 and, let's say, 1899, we're talking about over 120 million Muslims from Alaska to Chile, who were all Moors and were all so-called Autochtons, who had turbans and feathers and all of that. That whole history was redone and redistributed under this new Native American history, by which now, the forefathers and the foremothers of these people who call themselves Native Americans today, right, they're looking at us like we're descendants from them, when really they're descendants from us. That's why they're still wards of the state, and the Moors are totally free. So in order for anybody to really get back to where they need to go, we all need to understand where we came from. And because if you don't know where you came from, you won't know where you're going. So again, I just wanted to get it straight and let you know that you are what your forefathers and ancestors were today. So when it comes to your ancient history as Almaracanos, meaning Almaracanos Estados, a Moorish estate that was always here, there are books and stuff like that you can get. There's a book called African Presence in Early America. There's another book called When Nations Gather by Sultan Abdul Latif. There's another book called Othello's Children in the New World by Jose Pimenta Bay. There's another book called The Diplomatic Relations of the United States and the Barbary Powers by Edwin. There's another one called The Wars in Barbary by Chidsey. There's another book called Ancient Asiatic Kingdoms in America by Barry Fell. Another one by Barry Fell named Saga America. Another one called America BC. You want to start to get these books so that way you can debunk this. So that way when you show up at the powwow and everything with your feathers and your headdress and your fez and all of that, and they start talking to you like, what you doing here? You can look at them and say, I've been here. The actual government of the United States, what we perceive as the United States government, is totally foreign to the jurisdiction of America. Yet it is there to represent the interests of America. Yet it is supposed to be doing those interests of and for America, but it is not. It's only doing everything for itself because it has now reached a point where really nobody is in control of it. Nobody's really in control of how the United States government is sinking further and further into its own disparaging position in the world, to the point where you have other people like Russia, for instance, or China, who are right now doing war games off the coast of New York, off the coast of Alaska, and off the western coast. You have now, due to all of the wars that the United States started in the Middle East, you actually have children washing up on the shores of European countries like Spain and Italy and things like that, and that's really horrible. And those things are happening due to the fact that the United States has consolidated itself almost to be octopus. And every country that is de facto then comes into its grasp. And then they, like the octopus puts the ink in the water so you can't see where it goes. That's exactly what the United States has done. So because of the war amendments, because of the executive orders, because the constant state of emergency, because the fact that you actually have not had a judge in this country, a lawful judge in this country since 1789. You haven't had a lawful Bashar, aka a marshal, in this country since 1790. You haven't had a
But the country is still running, quote.
No, the country is not running. What's running is
because that's what people think and perceive and see.
Right.
So it's just to create.
But what's running really is not what we perceive as the country is really the corporation. You can't take what makes a people great, and you can't subjugate a people and then leave them what made them great. You got to get them to either throw that off, say that stuff don't exist, or you got to make them believe that what you got is better than what they had. And that's what they did. It's all marketing. Everything that happened with this thing happened with marketing. But you got to remember, too, is that none of this stuff happened with Caucasian people themselves being the ones in control doing it. We didn't fall to no quote-unquote white man. We fell to our own people who then, once divided, now decided to use this so-called white man to disinherit each other by proxy. And then once enough of us were disinherited through this process, that so-called white man realized that this was his chance. And he rose up and did what he needed to do to make sure he would never be enslaved again. And so the perpetual the perpetual need to constantly make melanated people be inferior or be on some sort of animalistic level is the basis by which you know that he is truly inferior. Based upon the fact that if you are totally superior, one who is in a total superior position never has to prove that position. You just are. So you'll never hear somebody like me, per se, not saying I'm superior, but I'm superior in my position, in my life, based upon what I've done to get to a point where nobody in this country or in this world can come to me and tell me anything about myself. Whether it be as myself as an individual, myself as a Moor, myself as a national, myself as a member of the Republic, myself as a child of God. Nobody can tell me that. So the thing about it is, when you don't know your history and you just take on history for face value, that means that this cracker could say, well, hey, I got you from the moon, man. What you gonna say? You don't know. You don't know.
Makes sense.
Can I nationalize without calling myself a Moor and call it what I want to call it, but and trace it into my indigenous inheritance?
Can you answer that question?
September 13th, 2007.
Interestingly, 144 nations stood up and said all indigenous peoples have the right to self-autonomy. 5 nations in the UN voted against those 144, and all the ones that voted were non-indigenous nations: the United States, New Zealand, Australia, Great Britain, and what was the 5th? Canada. Now, based on what the brother just asked the question, to address it direct, we have the right, which means the power, to implement autonomous, aboriginal, indigenous jurisdictions, and we have the backing of 144 nations besides the ones that want to fight us. The only thing that is between us and our freedom is our ignorance and our fear. The ignorance is not knowing. We're addressing that right now. The fear we are not addressing, because we as men, if the brother stood up and asked that question, do we need to pray to the ancestors to get help to get these people off us? I'm going to tell you the problem and the answer. Our women will produce the children that are necessary because they have the power, the spiritual capacity to do that, unlike any other women. But our men are motherfucking cowards. And I say that with a big exclamation point, because no men on earth will look around and say, who will recognize me? So, we need defense, because we can be Choctaw, etc., and still be recognized. We could be Cherokee, we could be Saraji, we could be those things. You don't have to necessarily, presently right now, say that you are Moorish American. You can if you want to. That is the international mandate. Now, the question doesn't have to go to whether I'm going to call myself Choctaw, which is the original Algonquin, or as a Moorish tribe, or etc. I can do all that. The implementation will come when our brothers stand up and defend their goddamn family. Stand up together and work economically, which we can do. We have the resources. And protect the women so they can do what they do best, which is govern the family. It's a wrap after that.